I can tell he's in a Baptist church because there's a clock on the wall. How many Baptists we got here? Well, not enough to hurt. Okay. No, I'm kidding. I'm Baptist, I can talk about it. This is a special afternoon. Most of you know that I MC gospel concerts, but to do something a little different rarely comes along in our field. But this is a special afternoon, and I'm looking forward to it. We're just going to jump right into it today. And I want you, some of you have been here quite a while, I know. Would you stand with me, everyone standing all across the auditorium? And I don't know if it's in order or out of order, but I'm going to ask God's blessing upon this afternoon. If you'd pray with me. Father, we thank you again for this opportunity to be back in this great town of Lebanon. And we certainly appreciate the Lions Club for what they have done and what they do for this community. And this special program this afternoon. Father, I just ask that you be with these two women. A fantastic story they're going to be sharing with us today in these brief moments together. Forgive us where we fail you. Keep us in your care. In Jesus' name I pray. And everyone said, amen. Turn around and shake at least 6 people's hands you haven't said hello to, and then you can be seated. All right?
I do a light shot.
All right, I said 6, not 106. Now sit down. We've got to get this thing started. Well, I want both of these ladies to come up. We'll introduce them very quickly together. Most of you know this young lady that's coming up right over here. She's from this area, married into a family from this area. And I want you to welcome her. This is Liz Hutton. Give her a nice welcome, all right? I've known Liz for quite a while. I don't know near as much about her story as I do this next lady. Lilly Isaacs, I've had the opportunity to work with her family for almost 30 years now. We've been in different places. Yeah, Lilly doesn't like to hear that. It is true, though. I was looking at the calendar the other day. Almost 30 years we've worked together all across the country, great concerts, and it's a joy to be in my home state of Missouri, and of course, Lebanon holds a special place in my heart. But I want you to really let her know you're glad she took part of her afternoon to share her special story with you. How about it for Lilly Isaacs, all right? Lily's going to start things off, and then we'll just go from there. Real informal this afternoon, just hang in here with us and enjoy.
Can you hear me? Yes. You can hear? No. Okay. My wonderful sound engineer is back there, so let me know when you can hear me. Testing 1, 2. How's that? Okay, I'll try not to yell. I'm used to a different type of mic, so I never use this. I'm not a preacher, so I'm not used to these things. But anyway, it certainly is a pleasure to be here with you this afternoon. And when Chuck got in touch with me, a few months ago, and asked if I would be willing to get in touch with Liz, and she and I would share, because we have a lot of the same story together. You know, I get excited because I love talking about the history of my family. I love sharing the obstacles that they've overcome to give myself and my brother a life. So I know that my story is different from Liz, and which is kind of interesting because they both tie in together. So just to tell you a little bit about myself, my parents are Jewish, and my mother and father were born in Częstochowa, Poland, which is near Warsaw. When World War II broke out in 1939, my mother was almost 20, my father was 30, and they were both still living at home. And they had large families. My mother was one of 5 children. My father was one of 7 children. And rumor had it that the war was escalating and that the Nazis were coming into all parts of Poland. My parents didn't really know that much about it. Of course, those days it wasn't like today with TVs and internet and all that. It's just mostly word of mouth. So both of them had interesting stories because my father was still living at home with his parents and his family, helping to provide. They lived more in the farmlands of Częstochowa. And my mother was the oldest at home. She had 3 siblings at home that were younger than she, and also had a sister a little younger than her that had polio or something like that because she could never walk in her life. She was pretty much bedfast. So one day, my grandmother, who was widowed, sent my mother and the 2 younger siblings, not the one that was crippled, to the neighboring town because she heard that the Nazis were coming into Częstochowa. And she didn't want my mother and the siblings to be subjective to whatever it was that was going to happen. Sure enough, it took them all day to walk the few miles they did there and back, and my mother said she was confused, but she minded her mother. And while they were gone, the Nazis came into Częstochowa and ordered everyone out on the streets and captured a lot of the Jewish people, put them in trucks and buses, and took them off. During the war, of course, people were in certain camps and wound up in different places in Germany. My mother had found out that her mother, my grandmother, and her sister that was crippled with polio was killed immediately. They didn't take them to camps. They didn't make it. But then the rest of them did. When my mother got home with her sister and brother, they were there probably another couple of days before they were also captured and taken to camps. Same particular story with my brother, with my father. He had brothers and sisters at home and a mother and a father, and he was captured that day. He's told us stories of how the sirens would be so loud when they would drive in through the town of Częstochowa, Poland, and ordered everyone to come out on the street with perhaps a small bag or whatever, and they didn't know what was about to happen, except that they knew they had to go. All these Nazi soldiers were with guns and every other kind of ammunition was there, and they were knocking on doors and making people come out. And my father shared a story with me of how he went out on the street with his family and was made to lie down on the ground with his hands behind his back on the ground for hours and hours, until they finally came across different people walked through there and they said, you go here, and separated families that way. So my father lost contact with all of his family, except for one brother who was in the same camp that he was in. So that was about the last time that my parents saw many of their siblings and their family. And that begins the story of the ghettos. My mother just passed away in September at the age of 95. She really is a fighter. She fought hard. The last few years of her life, she had dementia. But over the years, we got to talk to my mother a lot more than we did my father. My father passed away at the age of 69. Because of the war, he developed a drinking problem and became an alcoholic. And many times I use this in my testimony at night in our concerts because there are a lot of hurting people out there who has someone in their families that have an abuse problem for one reason or another, whether it be alcohol or drugs or anything. And I was really absorbed in my youth and wanted to fit in with my friends and school and everything that I was doing when I was younger, that I really didn't dig into my dad's mind and get to know him as much as I wish I had. So there's a lot of unanswered questions to me about his life and what was left behind. And I was only able to grab bits and pieces during my lifetime, and then things that my mother had shared with me. So I don't know a whole lot about their ghetto experiences, except that they were in the ghettos. And my mother said that they were made to work like in factories, and the conditions were not good, but they were not nearly as bad as they were in the concentration camps. So this year, this past May, I wrote my autobiography. It took me about 7 or 8 years to write it because I just wanted to be careful and not say things I shouldn't. But it was too important for me to want to carry on my legacy. And being Jewish, let this never happen again. And you know, we live in a world today where a lot of genocides are happening. And it's sad. And I don't want to get into politics, that's not why I'm here. But I know if we're aware of things that happen, then we're not so easy to let them happen again. So I try to share my story everywhere we go, because I honor my ancestors that died in the war, and especially my parents who survived. So I've chosen just a couple of stories to just give you an idea of things that my parents had shared with me. This is my father's story, part of his story. The train took my father to Buchenwald, one of the largest concentration camps in Germany. It was originally established as a refugee tent camp for Polish nationals after the German invasion of 1939. The first 110 Polish prisoners had died in weeks from exposure and starvation. 2,000 more arrived in October, and an additional 10,000 arrived by the end of the year. Initially, my father received a quart of soup and a ½ ounce of bread each day, and that was meant to support him while he worked upwards of 15 hours each day. The rations were soon changed to a bowl of soup and a bread crust, and my father's weight plummeted. Sickness ruled the camp. Additional clothing or shoes were not provided, so as the weeks wore on and the clothes wore out, some worked with no shoes. Their clothes disintegrated into rags. Early on, his job involved carrying heavy bricks up a ladder. Balance, take a step up, balance again, another step. Do not move too fast or you will fall. Do not move too slow or you will be shot. Keep moving, keep balancing, keep living. One day he paused just a moment. Rest. The bricks were so heavy. He was so hungry. He closed his eyes just a moment. When I was a child, I would reach up to my father's face and feel the tiny scar on his forehead, that smooth gash of silent skin. I wouldn't ask him how he got it, but I would run my small finger along it, marvel at its smoothness and the way it dipped down into his skin. But all scars have a story. A passing soldier, perhaps catching my father's resting for just a moment, slammed a brick into his head. My father collapsed on the ground. Blood ran, life puddled among the stones. My own existence was in the balance in that moment, and the existence of my children and grandchildren. How fragile that small green shoot of life that brought me into being. How tenaciously it pushed toward the sun. When my father finally stood, blood ran into his eyes, down his neck, onto his clothing. He had to keep moving. He had to work. He had to live. Meanwhile, the commandant decided to have an indoor riding arena built for his wife, adding to the workload of the inmates. Elsewhere in the camp, doctors performed medical experiments on the prisoners. By the end of 1943, Buchenwald contained 37,000 people. Later, in 1944, inmates at forced labor camps in Czestochow were also shipped to Buchenwald, swelling the numbers to 112,000. But when the 6th Armored Division of the U.S. Army reached the camp on April 11, 1945, there were only 21,000 people left to be liberated. The missing 90,000 had been exterminated. Yet my father survived it all. He survived the brick to the head, the years of malnutrition. He survived the cold and the heat, the sickness and the loneliness. He survived multiple concentration camps. When he walked out of that hell in 1945, his 6-foot 1-inch frame was wrapped tightly with just 100 pounds of flesh. Deteriorating muscle. He left the camp but had no idea where to go. He had no family. He was stunned by the state of the world, and initially his freedom was nearly as overwhelming as his captivity. What did freedom have to offer? He still had no clothes, no food, no work. He found a relief camp and took refuge there among thousands of other people who couldn't believe what they had been through, what they had just survived. My father's brother, who had survived all those years in the camps, died shortly after they were liberated. And the name of that relief camp, it was in Feldafing, Germany, and that's where he met my mother. Even though they were both from the same town of Czestochow, Poland, they hadn't known each other. They wound up in the same relief camp. So this is just a little story of my mother's side. When the roundup of Jews began in the ghetto of Czestochow, My mother fought to stay with Zlata, her younger sister. They clung to one another against the chaos sweeping through the neighborhood. First, they went to work in the camp in Poland, but soon they were herded together yet again for another purpose. This time, they were loaded on the trains, the crowded cattle cars. Rolling over those endless miles of track, the trains sounded ominous to the passengers. Would they be tortured, killed? Wherever they were going, they knew it wasn't good. And the train was taking them there. For hours it moved, stopping only to take one more Jew, one more Jew, one more Jew. There was no food. Sometimes a German soldier doused the windowless cars in water, and the passengers looked toward the sky, mouths open, trying to capture the drops drip through the dirty ceiling. Anything to quench their thirst. Every time the train stopped, my mother said, we thought everybody was going to get killed. They could have done it just like that. They often did. The train came to a stop, and for the first time, the passengers were allowed to walk around. My mother looked through the door and saw a small town. Standing at the edge of the town was someone selling bread. Her stomach rumbled at the thought of food, real food, so she and a friend wandered close to the guard. The two young girls flirted with the Nazi soldier. He smiled. He let them buy bread. My mother and her 4 friends broke it into 5 pieces, devouring it in a matter of seconds before getting back on the train. For over a week they rode that train, a few bites of bread their only meal. I've never gone through that long without food. I can only imagine how weak they must have felt, how they dreamed of eating, and a comfortable place to rest. But the only relief they received came in a series of shouts. Get out! Soldiers shouted, banging on the train with their hands and their guns. Get out! Get out! As they got out of the train cars, they left many dead or nearly dead lying on the floor behind them. They had arrived. They were at the camp of Bergen-Belsen. Bergen-Belsen. The Nazis established Bergen-Belsen in 1940, originally for the French and Belgian prisoners of war. But like many camps, it quickly filled with Jews, and Nazis either wanted to exterminate or exchange with Allied forces for the capture of German soldiers. My mother arrived at Bergen-Belsen in January. The ground was hard, covered in snow, and the air was cold. The Nazis stripped her, and soon she was numb, standing there in the winter air. The women all stood around, naked in the January day, crossing their arms, trying to stay decent, trying to stay warm. Guards shaved their entire body, and then she was driven along with the others into a large building. She thought they were about to die. Instead, they were given showers and the camp outfits, and then led to the barracks. The building was designed for 100 people, but each building contained girls in their teens and 20s. The guards made them burlap sacks to use as blankets and chamber pots. Eventually, they housed 500 to 1,000 people in each. The smell inside the barracks was overwhelming. My mother's schedule was basic and for the most part unchanging. Sleep as well as you could, on a bed if you could find an empty space, or on a wooden floor among the chamber pots. Guards woke them at 5 a.m. and then roll call was given, out in the cold. Some days it went on for hours. Some days they stood there in sleet or snow or cold or rain while the Germans called out their names. Feet grew numb, muscles shouted with pain. Those who fell over were usually shot where they lay. As poor as the conditions were inside the wooden barracks, my mother still chose to stay inside as much as possible. Outside of its walls, predatory Nazis guards took to rape or kill based on their mood. Get too close, they would shoot you. Of course, you could also be shot for absolutely nothing at all. Everybody was scared, my mother said, scared they were going to get killed. Nourishment came at the front of the food line. A roll that had to last for days, a cup of black coffee, and one bowl of watery soup, sometimes with nothing in it but grass. Later in the war, as German stores depleted, the daily rations dwindled to even less than that. It seemed as if they were always being put in lines and separated, either to do jobs or get food, or simply turn around or go back to the barracks. Yet lines often led to worse things than a cup of grass-filled soup and watered-down coffee. One day, as my mother waited in line with her sisters Lotta and her friend Sabrina, a soldier began separating the women. You this way, and you that way, you this way. Initially, the girls were separated. My mother directed to the left, while Sabrina and Zlata remained in line. Suddenly, as the line began to move forward, Sabrina grabbed my mother's arm. She's coming with me, Sabrina said, and the guard ignored her, allowing my mother to change lines. The line my mother had been in first went to the gas chamber. Everyone in that line was killed that day. The line that Sabrina pulled my mother into received their normal ration and went back to their barracks. Day after day, week after week, year after year, the difference between life and death could be something as simple as a guard separating people into lines, or a prisoner taking one step too close to the fence, or a random tug of a soldier's trigger finger, or the angelic action of a friend named Sabrina. And I think that was a miracle that Sabrina pulled my mother from that line. So she survived, and my parents stayed in Feldefing when they were liberated in 1945. They stayed in Feldefing for a couple of years, where they were helped with medical needs and nourishment to get them back to health. But one thing that was very hard, and I didn't think about it till I started writing my book, was when everyone was freed from the camps, what exactly was free? Everything they ever knew was taken away from them. Their homes destroyed, their families were killed. They had nothing, and they had no place to go. So when they said you're free, what do you do with that? How do you process that? And I'm so grateful for such wonderful organizations like B'nai B'rith, United Jewish Appeal, and on, that came into Germany and Poland and helped these displaced persons, my people, find a new life. And that's exactly what many of them did. I just heard the other day there's about 160,000 Holocaust survivors left in the world, and most of them live in Israel now. We're also still in poverty. They don't have family left, and they don't live like they would without companionship, and that saddens me. But my parents did survive. I was born in Feldefing after they were married, and we came to America when I was 2 years old. We had an uncle that sponsored us here, and we started life anew. It wasn't easy. We fought hard to have what we have, and God blessed us. I grew up in a loving home. My father became a bread baker. We scrapped things together, and my parents gave me a wonderful life. Living in New York City, I was in a melting pot of great culture. There were all kinds of people that were our neighbors that I went to school with, and I loved to love people and learn about them and share with each other everything that we need to know about other people. I grew up with a love of music as well. And when I was just a teenager, I got involved in show business. And I got a job working on off-Broadway because I studied acting. In 1967, as a young girl in New York, of course, I was a hippie. And I got an album deal on Columbia Records and recorded a folk album with another young lady, which was a great opportunity. And we did nightclubs, and I worked in a place called Gertie's Folk City for about 6 weeks. And it was a very popular hotspot in the city. That's where Bob Dylan was discovered, and Peter, Paul, and Mary. And those of you that would remember them, it was very exciting to do that. There was another band there playing with us at the same time, and they were from Kentucky, a bluegrass band called the Greenbrier Boys. So during that 6 weeks engagement is when I met my husband. He was the banjo player for this bluegrass band. We fell in love from two different worlds. He was the baby child of 17 children whose father was a Pentecostal preacher. You know, he wasn't saved at the time, and I didn't care, neither did he. So we had a 2-year courtship, long distance, from Kentucky and New York. And then in 1970, we got married. We never thought anything. I wasn't religious. He wasn't religious, even though his parents were preachers. So we just let life go along. But he had a brother. We were married just a few months. He had a brother get killed in a car accident. He was 27 years old. It was very tragic. And because of that death, we wound up in church with the family one night. And I won't go into that detail because it's way too long, but that night is when I found out about Jesus. Being taught against the name of Jesus all my life, it was, something that I never even entertained. But conviction hit my heart that night. I didn't know what it was. For the first time in my life, I got on my knees and called out to God and asked him to help me understand what I was feeling. And that was the beginning of the most wonderful journey of my life. But it didn't come without a cost, because a few months after I found the Lord, my parents found out through a cousin of mine I was going to church, and they disowned me. They told me that I was never welcome to come home again unless I gave up that crazy religion. And I had a very painful year or two because of that. But it didn't stop me. Because all that my parents had been through, all I'd been through, I found pure joy through Jesus Christ, Yeshua, the real Messiah. And it was very difficult for me in my lifetime to share with my family. But one day when I was praying about it, I said, God, help me to know how to witness to them. And a sweet, still voice spoke to me, and I know it was God. He said, just live the life in front of them. And that's what I tried to do. My father passed away. We were in the room with him a few days before he died, and I got to pray for him. He never prayed out loud. He didn't know what that meant, but I prayed with him. When I lost Mom this past September, I asked the Lord to give me a few moments of time alone with her, not with the rest of my brother. They're not believers. And 10 minutes before she died, I walked into her room, and I read Psalms 23, and I had a prayer for her. I don't know if she heard me, but when I went to kiss her face was cold, even though her hands were still warm. I pray that she heard my prayer. I'm so grateful for my upbringing. I'm thankful for the opportunity that my family and I have to minister. God blessed me with 3 amazing children that sing, and I hope you guys get to come to the concert tonight to hear my family, because I know that's why God spared me. And I'll end with this, but Joe and I were divorced 16 years ago. I don't want to get into that either. Things happen, and we've moved on. We remain friends. But I never would have thought that over 70 years ago, my parents were on a train car, traveling from Poland to Germany to be exterminated by the Nazis. But yet they lived to tell the story. Then they gave birth to me. And then I have these 3 amazing kids that can sing. We never had to teach them a thing. That was saved when they were little children. And we travel the world proclaiming the name of Yeshua. That is a miracle to me. And I thank God for my life, for what he's done in my life. And I'm excited to hear Miss Liz tell the rest of the story. Thank you.
Thank you, Lilly. As Liz comes forward, there will be a time for questions in just a little bit, so we're going to let Liz share an equally amazing story at this time, and then we'll get to the question answer period. Let's welcome Liz one more time.
All right, that's going to be difficult to follow. Thank you. All right. Some of you know this, that I'm a history teacher here at the high school, and so I'm going to give you a history lesson. But I try to make it fun. Anyway, I'm going to give you some history of Poland, since her parents were Polish Jews. Also, my story of Irena Sendler was also in Warsaw, Poland, so just miles apart in the same situation, but different stories too. All right, so I'm going to give you a little history of Poland. Poland right now has actually been the longest individual country on its own than it ever has in history. But a lot of different countries have tried to come in and take it over. It has a lot of natural resources. However, during World War II, Hitler and Russia, so the Nazis and Russia both decided to split up Poland because of its natural resources. But of course, we all know that Hitler had a different thing in mind. Poland had the largest amount of Jews living in Europe, next to Israel, of course. And so that is why Hitler is going to target Poland. The Nazis invade Poland in 1939, on September 1st, 1939, and September 2nd, the war breaks out. Shortly after that, in 1940, the Warsaw Ghetto was established. And the Warsaw Ghetto ended up being about 14 blocks, and that's roughly from McDonald's to Price Cutter, where they forced 450,000 Jews into 15 blocks. That ended up being about 7 people per room, and that didn't mean those 7 people were your family. Obviously, during this time too, they don't, indoor plumbing is just starting. Not everybody had indoor plumbing. Some of you probably didn't even have indoor plumbing when you were in high school, right? I know my grandparents told me about when they first got indoor plumbing, and that was in the 50s and 60s. So in the 40s, they're still trying to get indoor plumbing. Doesn't work real well either. So if you can imagine, the worst part of town is where they were forced to live, and in very unsanitary conditions as well. In Warsaw alone, they had about a 30% population that were Jewish, and so almost all of those, if they didn't escape prior to Hitler's invasion, they were forced to live in the ghetto. And the Jews actually built the ghetto walls and contained themselves in there. They were forced to do that. In the ghetto alone, 83,000 people died. That's before they were even deported. That's from disease, mainly. If you were in the Warsaw Ghetto, almost always you were deported to Treblinka. And Treblinka was just a death camp outside of Warsaw, about 90 miles. I've been there. Unlike most of the concentration camps and death camps around, this one was destroyed right afterward, and it was just a death camp, so whenever the Nazis would bring in the Jews from the ghetto, they were taken off the trains, and they were put into a gas chamber, and they were killed immediately. So if you ever visit there today, though, it doesn't look like a regular concentration camp as today. If you go visit Auschwitz, Dachau, most of those places have reestablished some of their, what it would have looked like. They have some of the same barracks and things, but at Treblinka there's nothing there. It's in the middle of a cedar forest, and there's rocks everywhere, and each one of those rocks represented a Jewish town that was destroyed by the Nazis. There was over 800,000 Jews that were killed at Treblinka before it was destroyed. Treblinka only lasted about 2.5 years. After the third uprising that happened there, the Nazis shut it down because about 300 Jews escaped. Of course, they can't have that happen. All right, now to my story. Irena Sendler was a Catholic social worker in Warsaw, and she started saving Jews before she was even asked to do so. She forged documents for adults, and she even married one of the adults that she saved. Anyway, she was asked by a group called Żygota to come in and take over the children's department of saving people. And so she decided to take that on, and in a 1.5 years, she saved 2,500 Jewish children from the Warsaw Ghetto. She would do that. She started with orphans, and then once she got most of those out, if they hadn't died, she started asking families. And she said that was the hardest thing. She said actually the hardest thing was to convince grandparents to give up their children. And I know some of you could probably attest to that. But she couldn't guarantee them that they could get out safely, but she said at least we should try. Most of the Jews didn't exactly know what their demise would be. They didn't know for sure that they were going to be killed. Most of them assumed, and so it was really difficult for Irena to say, well, I can't really guarantee that your child will be safe once she's out or he's out, but we can at least try, because otherwise you know what's going to happen to you. So she started saving children as many ways as she could. 3 main ways that she used. One of them was using a tram car. She had a lady that worked with her on the Żygota department, which was part of the Polish underground, whose husband had ran a morning tram. And most of those started before 6 o'clock. And so he agreed, but he didn't want to know any details. Because if you know about this time period, if you were ever caught with a Jew, you would be killed immediately, your family would be killed, or you would be interrogated and killed that way as well. So he didn't want to know anything, so if he was ever caught, he couldn't give out any information, which was very bold on his part. Anyway, he said, as long as you get this child on the tram before I leave in the mornings, I don't care, just don't tell me what day it is, don't tell me who's doing it, I don't want to know anything, right? And so what Irena would do, she started saving babies because they were a little bit easier to package and get out. And so she would actually sedate them, put them in a package, of course, have air holes, all that kind of stuff. She would have somebody slip it underneath one of the chairs on the tram, and then some point in the morning, somebody else would get on the tram, pick up that package, get off with it, and then they would get the child out of the Warsaw Ghetto. She ended up saving children up to 11 years old. She didn't do much older than that, only because kids get big. Even though most of the kids during that time, if they're in the ghetto, of course they're not real big because they do have rations. You mentioned bread and soup. The Warsaw Ghetto, at one point, you could get 300 calories per day. That's like a small cup of yogurt. Anyway, kind of lost track here. Another way she would get these children out was using sanitation trucks. She was a social worker. She was allowed to go in and out of the ghetto to check on disease. Typhus was rampant. And so she used one of those trucks. And Irena was a small lady. She was about just under 5 foot tall, or right at 5 foot tall. And she was really young when she first started. So a lot of the Nazis didn't really think she was intimidating by any means. She was a woman. That also has a stereotype, especially during that time. And so she would drive this truck in and out of the ghetto. She would also have a German Shepherd with her. And if this baby would ever start crying, one of the ways she would also use was a carpenter's box, one of those old wooden carpenter's box with the top that comes out, okay? She would put the child in there and sedate it, but if it ever woke up at any point, she would tap the dog on the nose and it would start barking. The trucks were always examined in and out of the ghetto, and so if that child woke up especially, she would have the dog bark, and then that Nazi Gestapo worker, if he was checking the truck, going around looking to see if anybody had escaped, he usually was kind of frazzled by this big dog barking in his face, so he usually just let this little petite lady go on through. And then a third popular way she liked to use was smuggling through the Warsaw courthouse. The courthouse was right on the edge of the ghetto line, and the back was in the ghetto and the front was on the Aryan side. And so there were some secret corridors, and so she had a friend who also worked at the courthouse, and they would pay off some guards to let these people go through. And so she would send this child through one way of the courthouse and meet up with another person on the other end, and that person would walk the child out. Now what does she do with the children after they're out of the ghetto? Well, that was another challenge. A lot of people in the city didn't want to take these children in because the Gestapo occupied the city. They were always looking to see who was hiding Jews. So a lot of times she couldn't really find families inside of Warsaw, but she did find families in the countryside. She did use Catholic orphanages, and sometimes she even dressed up the little boys as girls. Does anyone know why that would have happened? No class participation? Okay. Okay, Jewish history. Do you guys know what bar mitzvah is? Okay, there's a tradition for circumcision, and little boys aren't circumcised until bar mitzvah. And so if they were dressed up as little girls, then the Nazis wouldn't check for that. If they're a little boy, then they're going to check for that. So she would dress them up. She would also teach them some Catholic prayers just to get by. Even though Catholics were targeted, of course they're not the #1 target. She would also teach him some Polish or some German too, because a lot of Jews during this time taught Yiddish or Hebrew. And so if they're speaking in Yiddish or Hebrew, dead giveaway. So she had thought and thought and thought all throughout this process what to do. Also, what she did with these children, 2,500 children, I can't keep track of my 130 kids that I teach every day. So what she did was write down the names of these children on a piece of paper. She wrote down their Jewish name, of course, their birth name, their parents' name, and where they lived before they were put into the ghetto. And then she gave them a new Christian name just for the purposes of saving them and getting them out of the ghetto. and she would write down where she adopted him out to. And she kept all of those pieces of paper in a jar that was buried underneath an apple tree right across from the German barracks. And it was at a friend's house that she was the gardener for, and she would come in weekly and dig up this jar, put the pieces of paper in, put it back, and it was right there underneath the Nazis' noses. All right, she did this in a year and a half. The Warsaw Ghetto was not liberated until 1945, and she got caught in 1943. She was taken to the infamous Pawiak prison in Warsaw, where lots of people were tortured and were killed. And they did not have any solid evidence on her, but they knew she was the instigator of this program. But they couldn't really prove it, so they beat her. They broke her legs and her feet daily for about 90 days. And then she was put on the execution list. However, Jagoda, the people she worked for, liked her well enough that they paid off the German soldiers and the prison workers, and they put executed by her name on that prisoner's list, but she was let go. She had to go into hiding, but she still organized these savings. She was in hiding whenever her mom actually passed away, and by that point, the Gestapo knew that she had been let go and not actually executed, so they were looking for her, so she didn't even get to attend her mother's funeral. After the war in 1945, she and the other leader of Jagoda took the name, she made 2 copies, and his name was Adolf Berman, and he went to Israel, and she stayed in Warsaw. Most of the Jews after the Holocaust and World War II went back to their homeland in Israel. And today she had met up with about 2,000 of those people that she had saved, and they knew that they were Jewish. And we estimate that there's about 500 or so that probably never knew they were Jewish because they were infants when they were born, and there was hardly any, about 2% survival rate out of Warsaw Ghetto and out of Treblinka. And so a lot of those had no family that was left. And so when Irena would adopt these children out, she told them that to these new parents, said, okay, it's up to you. Whenever they are old enough, you can tell them. You need to tell them, period. Now, if there's nothing, no family left or whatever, then of course that's your choice to keep that child to take care of. And a lot of these kids, that's why we said that there's probably about 500 or so that never knew that they were Jewish because there was no family, and so the adoptive parents probably never even told them. That would be really difficult to tell. There was one extra story I was going to tell you about a lady. Her name was Elżbieta Fikowska, and she was 6 months old. She was born in the ghetto, and she was 6 months old when she was taken out, and she was taken out through the carpenter's box. And her parents didn't have any type of birth certificate or anything, so they created a spoon, a silver spoon with her name and her birthday, and that's all she had left of her family. And she's done a lot of research on it, but she was 17 when she found out that she was Jewish. And that's a hard time. You're in high school. She was being made fun of, and so she went home and she said, people are saying I'm Jewish, why are they saying I'm Jewish? So she sat her down, but Irena had been a family friend, so she also called Irena in, and she said, well, yes, you are Jewish, and this is the lady who actually saved you out of the Warsaw Ghetto. And so she'd made a lifetime commitment to find any piece of ancestry she could. She did find out that her parents were actually killed. Her mother was killed in Treblinka, but her father refused to get on the train, and he was killed right there at the train depot. I have visited Poland 3 times. I started this project when I was a freshman in high school, and it was for the National History Day organization. And that high school was kind of rough for me, so it was really important for me to kind of figure out this story. A little bit about my background. I grew up with my grandparents because my mom was a meth addict, and she couldn't take care of me. And my dad was an alcoholic, and he couldn't take care of me. And so my dad's parents found out about my situation. I was abandoned by my mom. Foster care took me in, and then my grandpa found me, or found out about my situation. So I lived with them since I was 5. So I always struggled with, well, how could my mom abandon me? How could she give me up? You know, that's just, it really bothered me for a long time. And so whenever I found out about this story about Irena convincing moms and dads to give up their children, it kind of hit me. You know, my mother was in the middle of an addiction. She couldn't take care of me, so it was actually probably better for her to give me up because she couldn't take care of me. So when we found out about Irena, that she was still living, we decided that we would try to raise some money and go over to Poland. And we were raising money by selling a 50-cent candy bar. And that, of course, took forever. However, we performed this in Kansas City in January of 2001 to Shawnee Mission Schools. And there was a Jewish businessman who took a sabbatical from business to teach for a year. And he had a lot of connections. We performed on a Thursday. And on Saturday morning, my teacher called me and said, hey, John had actually raised $6,000 for you guys to go to Poland this summer. Do you want to go? I said, of course. So we went and met Irena, and it was the coolest thing ever. Again, she's a really short lady, and she had wounds from her time in Paviak prison. She always had to use a walker, and then she was eventually wheelchair bound. And anyway, she took us in. She loved us just like we were her own grandchildren. And then she told us all about how she saved these children and who helped her do it. And she never took credit for it. She always gave credit to the Jewish mothers who gave up their children, because that would be the hardest thing to ever do. I've been there 3 times. I've been to Auschwitz. I visited there. Very sobering experience. Nothing like it. It doesn't hit you until you go experience something like that. We went to Treblinka, visited there. We went with Elzbieta. That was her first time going, and that is where her mother died. So that was a very moving time. And then our last trip that we went, that was kind of our historical part. We wanted to interview anybody and everybody we could about the Holocaust. And then we also started raising money to help these Jewish people who survived the Holocaust. Because, like Lilly had mentioned, a lot of them are in poverty. They can't even afford simple medicines. They can't afford a wheelchair. They didn't have any type of family, so they had to start from nothing. And a lot of them didn't get much further from nothing. And so we started raising money for them. And now, after all of our research, we have a book that has been published, and we have a Hallmark movie that's been created, and all of that money goes, well, 60% of it, I should say, 60% of it goes to still helping these survivors of the Holocaust in Poland. And the rest of the money goes to paying off publishing, because that is expensive. But we don't make a profit on any of this stuff, but I do have books and DVDs if you're interested in more of that as well, and I'm sure Lilly has her books too. So I'm done, I believe, so. You guys have any questions for us?
Stay right there. I don't know about you, but this has been a sobering few moments. Yes. Lilly, would you come back and Liz stay here? And we are going to, if you think about when Lilly first mentioned the date, it kind of hit me, 70 years. Now, not to embarrass anybody here, we're all friends. But if you're in that 70 range, would you raise your hands? It's a short time, is it not? 70 years. These tragic things happened. And it's just, anyway, I'm at a loss for words. We're going to take a moment for you to ask questions. If you would like to ask a question, please stand to your feet. That'll help us out. And either one of these ladies will have to answer anything that they can, or maybe expound a little bit more upon something. Now, not everybody at once. Okay, here we go. Go ahead, man.
I saw Schindler's List, the movie, and some of what you just said, both of you, was in the movie. And so have you ever seen it? Is it pretty on to the way it really was?
I actually saw it with my mother. We talked her into going, and my whole family went with her. She was, of course, very emotional, but her comment to me, which this may strike you as odd, what she said, but there were some teenagers in the very back of the movie theater that came, and when they marched out with a lot of the naked people, they were snickering back there. And it offended my mother deeply, so that she made a big comment about that, and then the only other thing she said was they didn't show half of it. That's all she said.
Yeah, it's a little bit Hollywoodized, like most historical movies. However, I think they did a good description of, or depiction of how it could have been, but I think you can't really capture something like that. But I think they pulled at our hearts anyway to at least give us a good picture of what it was like.
Wonderful. So, yes, ma'am.
What is the name of the Hallmark movie?
It is called The Courageous Heart of Irena Sendler. And I have some out there, and mine are going to be a little bit cheaper than if you buy them online or whatnot. But if you don't want to do that today, you can do it another time. But The Courageous Heart of Irena Sendler.
Someone else. Yes, ma'am. Yeah, back here first. Go ahead, yes.
Yes, Lily, thank you for speaking to it. And Lily, how old were you when you first realized that your parents were survivors?
Let me repeat the question so she wants to know how old was Lily when she first realized what had transpired and what was going on.
To be honest with you, I don't remember ever realizing. I really don't, because our lives were the way they were, and I think I've always known because my parents, living in New York City, we were surrounded. We lived in a neighborhood that had Jewish people, survivors as well, so there was like a community of people like that, especially at the synagogue, and a melting pot of other people, so it was just a way of life. It wasn't like an aha moment who I was. It was just the makeup of who I was. I never really thought about realizing it. Does that make sense? It just always was.
Good question. Yes.
And my father was in World War II. He went in 42 and got out in 46, and he was in the Pacific. And as I was growing up, there'd be on TV, there'd be a war movie or something. My dad would say, they're not showing it like it really is. They're showing part of it.
Well, I thank you for your father's service.
Yes.
What, for your father and men and women like your father, I know I wouldn't be here today.
Right.
So, thank you.
Ann.
It's not so much a question, but Lily, could I ask you to share a little bit? I know you and your children and that you have gone back and visited, went and visited the camp. Could you share just a little bit about what that was like going back to the family?
Well, about 10 years ago, we were doing a European tour, and we got to perform near Germany. So we had some friends that had a camera crew and wanted to do a video of us going. We had an opportunity to go to Bergen-Belsen. So we didn't have a long time, we were just there for the day. And I remembered leaving that morning from the hotel in, we were in Amsterdam, and we left the hotel about 5 a.m. and drove for a couple of 3 hours. And when we got, I remember being so nervous, but what was the oddest thing to me is you drive into this area and you see the name of the camp on these big stones, you know. But what really devastated me was it was in the middle of farmland. And when we were there 10 years ago, there were, I mean, acres upon acres of all kinds of crops around there. So my question to one of the guides there was, has it always been like this? She said, yes. And I thought, thousands of people dying, starving, and there's like hundreds of acres surrounded with crops. So it was a very sobering moment for my family and I. And we walked in, and a lot of Bergen-Belsen was destroyed. The British burned it down because of all the typhus. So there wasn't any of the barrack stuff left. But one thing that happened is we sat in a room, and we had a beautiful tour guide who spoke English. And we saw films, old films in black and white, of how the British came in, and the British are the ones that actually liberated Bergen-Belsen, and what they did with soldiers, how they marched them around, of course all the bodies and everything you'd see in documentaries. And watching that was just, my heart just broke. But then they asked us to go in this other room and handed me these 2 books that were about this thick. And they said that the Nazis were very meticulous in keeping records on everything. Who was captured, who was taken to camps, who died, and they kept every kind of record. She said, your mother's name will be in these books. See if you can find it. And I mean, my hands were shaking. At that time, my mother was still alive, and lo and behold, my family and I hovered over. There were 8 of us just looking and searching, and they spelled, my mother's maiden name is Jakubowicz, which in English is Jacoby, and that's my granddaughter's name. So if you come tonight, you'll meet Jacoby. But Jakubowicz can be spelled with a Y, with a J, with an A or O, you know. So we had to go through so many, but finally we found it. We found my mother's name, and that was kind of an aha moment. I mean, I knew it, but just seeing her name in print that way was something else. And then they took us out to a replica. It might have been a refurbished train car. Do you want to say something?
No, I just, okay.
There was a train car there that I think it was an actual train car that they fixed up. And they walked us down where the tracks were, the way that the prisoners would be taken in. And they asked us to walk into the cart, into the train cart. And it was just a regular caboose with nothing in it. But what they did was they had sectioned off in yellow paint about a square foot all the way around, side by side. And there might have been like 30 of those. And they said in every square, a person was standing. And they showed us, you know, the opening and everything like that. But what was really, we stood there, frozen in time, my family and I did. And about 5 miles away from there now, they have a training, Army training campground. So they were shooting, had some kind of exercise, I guess, and it was raining. So we're standing in that car. It's dead quiet except for the rain hitting the top of the train car, and you hear shots being fired somewhere in the distance. And I just feel goosebumps when I think about it now. And my family and I we just held on to each other for dear life. It was just like we were there. And so that was it was an emotional day, but it was also, I wouldn't take anything for that experience. I wouldn't. Same thing happened to me when we went to Yad Vashem, which is the Holocaust. Have you been there?
Haven't been there.
You gotta go. It's gotta be another, maybe you can do another fundraiser. But Yad Vashem is the Holocaust Memorial Museum in Jerusalem. And there's a part in that in the museum that you walk out and there's a bridge that's over these huge tombstones that are in the ground, made in stone. And there's an eternal flame burning in the middle. And what they have on these stones are they've collected all the ashes from all the crematoriums that were liberated and buried them in these big areas, you know, with these big stones I want to describe. They were big slabs, and the name of the camp. And sure enough, the camps my parents were in were there, all the camps that they liberated. And right over there, you're told how many people died in that camp. But when we stood on that bridge again, and we've been there about 8 times, but maybe more. But standing over that bridge every time, I just have to weep because I know that my family is somewhere under that ground there because of the collection. So, you know, just experiencing that, and I don't know. I can't believe it even ever happened, but since it did, you know, I have to say again, you know, I can't let that die, and thank you for what you do.
Yes.
Really, thank you. I think that's an amazing story, and I want your book. And the movie. But I hope I answered your question. I have a tendency to ramble.
Thank you. We have time for one more question. Our time is getting away from us. Anyone else?
I have one. I can't stand up.
Yeah.
I have a question. Have you been to the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C.?
You're asking me? Yes, I have.
I mean, we went there, and it was just overwhelming.
Yes.
I mean, those 2 columns with the shoes, it was just, and then they gave you a book. When you go into the museum, they give you a book, and it's about this person, and you go through the book, and you go through the museum, and you don't know till the end of the tour whether that person was exterminated or were they liberated.
Wow.
And it's just, if you ever get a chance to go, it is such an awesome, sobering I mean, they have videos of accounts of the survivors, and it's just, it's mind-boggling. It's just so hard to wrap your mind around everything that you see and you hear.
Right, right.
Can I say one thing?
Go right ahead.
Corey Tendon, your story about Irena reminds me a lot of what Corey Tendon and her family did. A lot of you know that, The Hiding Place, another great story, and the jewelry shop, and they were not Jewish, but they helped, they hid adults too and babies, and they were, you know, I guess Corey lived till she was like 95 or 6 years old, and wonderful people in the world that, you know, we hear about that give, you know, they put their lives in danger just to help other people. And, you know, I admire people like that. I wish our world was like that today. I'm sure it is. I'm sure it is.
I wish this program could have been presented today for our young people in the schools to hear. And I know you've enjoyed these ladies, and Lily has her book in the lobby. Liz has a book and the DVD in the lobby. And would you say thanks again? These, I'm going to let's allow them to get to the lobby. And as we do that, I do want to say thanks to Hill.